Hello, my name's Thoughtline Miami. You might know me from TikTok. This is my first ever YouTube video, or sort of YouTube video in this format. It's very cool. Thank you ever so much for tuning in. I'm going to be doing a tier list of my favorite Greek philosophers. So let's have a look. So just a few disclaimers. This is all my opinion, I guess. I'm going to want to be ranking Greek philosophers in terms of how cool I think they are. My degree is in history and politics, undergraduate, but I never specialised in ancient civilizations or ancient Greece or anything of that nature. My history is a little bit more modern. This is not my expertise. Everything that I know through my own studies and through my own interests, so that's important to keep in mind as well. So important to note is that all of the historical figures I'm going to be bringing up for this tier list are men. Ancient Greek society simply didn't allow women to be philosophers. I think if they did, there would be plenty of women philosophers, and I'm sure quite a few of them would be on that list as well. It just so happens that the historical era we're looking at didn't allow women to do that, and that's very unfortunate. I look forward to making some more diverse content in the future, but for my first video, I thought I'd do something very simple, so we're just going to stick to Greek philosophers for now. All that being said, let's get into it. Only right that we start a ranking of Greek philosophers with what can only be described as the big cheese. Literally like the one who started it all. El Papi Grande! Socrates is without a shadow of a doubt one of the most important figures in not only Greek philosophy, but also like Western thinking, right? He is the foundation of a lot of these thinkers that a lot of these thinkers ended up basing themselves on. It's actually a little bit difficult to talk about some of Socrates' specific ideas because it's really important to remember that everything we know about Socrates, all of his ideas, even his history and his biography, is all as it is written and noted down by his student Plato, who we will of course go to talk on about later. What we do know is that there's a huge emphasis on self-examination and the acceptance of one's own ignorance, which is essentially the foundation of philosophy, because it's all about asking questions and accepting that not all truths are immediately reachable. And that's kind of epitomized in the quote that he's become famous for, which is the only thing that I know is that I know nothing. And that's essentially what philosophy is all about, and he said it better than anyone. And I think the end of Socrates' life, as essentially mandated by the polis of Athens, where, of course, he was ordered to do what he did, and he did it. That's a massive indicator as to how massively influential and game-changing his introduction of philosophical thinking was. I'm not saying he was the first philosopher, not by any means. I'm sure there are plenty before him that just weren't as widely recorded. But you have this idea that a man has challenged everything so much that they have to charge him with corruption of the youth in order to get rid of him. That in itself is extremely significant when you think about how all the philosophers that came after him were revered and accepted, with a few exceptions, and were able to continue their work, whereas he was considered so groundbreaking that they actually had to put a stop to it. So an absolutely exceptional philosopher, probably one of the most exceptional. However, I think Socrates is extremely limited by the fact that all that we know about him is due to the writings of another philosopher. Like, so much of him could have been left out, and there's so much of him that we might not even know about because everything about him is at the behest of someone else. So I think that puts a slight limit on it. Also, according to some historical sources, he was in fact ugly. For that reason, I can't quite give him S tier, but I am going to give him a very solid A tier. I think Socrates has to come first in terms of being the most influential philosopher in this conversation as the one who started it all, but Plato is very much a close second, or even sort of tied. Because I say Socrates started the phenomenon of philosophy, whereas Plato was the one responsible for turning it into an established institution. Plato was the student of Socrates who essentially followed him around throughout his career, writing down everything and maintaining these dialogues. So everything we know about Socrates comes from Plato, and it was Plato that produced the texts that we learn from Socrates and that we learn from the kind of philosophical principles in general. While you could describe Socrates' journey as a philosopher to be a bit more informal, Plato actually went on to establish his own philosophy academy, his own sort of school where he would disseminate both his teachings and those that he picked up from Socrates. So this dissemination can be seen in other philosophers. So, for example, Aristotle, who we'll go on to talk about, someone who also studied there. So he becomes this kind of figure of orthodoxy in Greek philosophy. And most of the other philosophers are either students of his or philosophers that rose up in defiance and opposition to his practices and teachings. However, it's also not fair to just write off Plato as a kind of Socrates clone. Like, Plato was very much his own philosopher, and he came up with his own ideas that have been massively influential. So we're thinking like the allegory of the cave, the four cardinal virtues, this massive emphasis on sort of storytelling in terms of explaining philosophy to people, because that's a huge thing. And I'm personally a big fan of that, with this idea that, well, if you convert all these philosophical ideas and methods into storytelling, then you make it way easier for your average person to understand. So while it's really easy to think of Plato as this incredibly boring, orthodoxy-based adjudicator of philosophy, it's really important to remember that the word Plato means broad, because he used to be a bodybuilder and wrestler. He was very famous for standing up and quite literally flexing on his opponents the moment he was argued against. Just stood up and flexed. So there's absolutely no disputing Plato's importance in not only Greek philosophy, but the history of Western thinking as well. The way I see it is that if Socrates was the foundation of Greek philosophy, then Plato is probably one of the biggest fortresses built on that foundation. I think Plato is one of the key figures, and you can make a very strong argument for him being one of the key figures in making this transition for this form of philosophy from being a disparate social movement to being more of an established and respected institution, using both the teachings of Socrates and his own ideas. The way I see it is that Socrates was the one that lit the torch, but Plato was the one that took the torch and ran with it. So there's massive significance in the timeline of Western philosophy, the establishment of the academy, the huge dissemination of his and Socrates' teachings, combined with the flexing thing, which is absolutely hilarious. I think it's very easy to put Plato in the S tier, no doubt. So we're going to finish off this part of the video with one more philosopher, a lesser-known philosopher perhaps, by the name of Heraclitus, who had some very interesting ideas, but also came up with one of my favorite quotes ever. No man ever steps into the same river twice, because it's not the same river and it's not the same man. So the belief system of Heraclitus is all about this idea that everything's in a constant state of change or flux, which is something that a lot of faith and belief systems function off today. But apart from that, that's all I got. Another notable thing about his belief system is that he believed that fire as an element was kind of the center of the world. It was like the foundational element that everything comes from, which is kind of related to the Greek creation myth, if you want to think about the story of Prometheus and things like that. So quite typical for a Greek belief system, I suppose. But I'd say that Heraclitus' main claim to fame outside of that is just being a miserable bugger. You know, he was famously arrogant, depressed, misanthropic, melancholy, and he was just generally well known and famed for being a buzzkill. Okay, so he came up with one really good quote that I really, really like, but not much else of his work has survived to the modern day, so we don't really know anything else, and the only thing else he was famous for was being the Squidward tentacles of the ancient Mediterranean. So we're going to have to put Heraclitus in C tier. So we're going to leave it there for now because I can't do it all in one go, but thank you ever so much for watching. This has been my first YouTube video. Leave a comment, or consider subscribing. I will be releasing part 2 as soon as I'm able to. I'm just not able to put it all together in one big chunk right now. But I look forward to covering Aristotle, Diogenes, Democritus, and all the rest of them pretty soon. So I enjoyed making this video, and I very much look forward to making more. But in the meantime, be sure to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. Till next time, ciao ciao.